I saw a reference to this speech by FDR delivered on the 23rd of September 1932. Now, this would be while he was running for president. He was elected in November, so this would have been about 2 weeks before the election. And he was in San Francisco. It was at the Commonwealth Club. I have spoken at the Commonwealth Club. In fact, for a long time, they had my speech up on their website. I went looking for the website today, and for some reason it wasn't loading, but I'm assuming that they're still there in San Francisco. But I gave a speech there about my book, The Crash of 2016, in fact. Well, FDR gave a speech there, too, back in 1932. And I just want to share a couple of pieces, and I was alerted to this, as I said, by a post over at Democratic Underground. So I went out and I dug up the speech, and there is no video or audio available that we can find. And we looked pretty thoroughly this morning, but the printout of the speech is, right here in my hands. And it's really, very often on this program, and when I'm debating conservatives, when I'm debating economics with conservatives, one of the main frames, one of the large questions that I ask, that I use is, economies are created by government, right? Governments, they print the money so that the economy can work. They create the rules of the economy. This is fraud. This is not fraud. This is what you can do. This is what you can't do. These are the penalties for doing wrong. Here's how the banks work. Here's how, business works. Here's what's tax deductible and what's not. In other words, businesses create economy, governments create economies within which businesses function. So the question is, why? Why? And FDR asks this question. I'd never read this speech before, but I've been saying for years and years, Jefferson writes, the first wake up for me on this was back in 1999, reading the collected works of Thomas Jefferson, where he was writing that, and in fact, arguing with Hamilton about, why do you have an economy? And writing that the purpose of an economy is to support the people. Just like the purpose of a government is to support the people, to support the quality of life of the average working person. The yeoman and the ploughman is how Jefferson referred to them. A yeoman is a person who works with their hands. A ploughman is a farmer. So FDR says, I want to speak not of politics, but of government. I want to speak not of parties, but of universal principles. The issue of government, Franklin Roosevelt said, and forgive me, I'm not even going to try and do an FDR imitation here. The issue of government has always been whether individual men and women will have to serve some system of government economics, or whether a system of government and economics exists to serve individual men and women. This is the big issue, right? He said, this question has persistently dominated the discussion of government for many generations. On questions relating to these things, men have differed, and from time immemorial, it's probable that honest men will continue to differ. And this is, conservatives would say, the purpose of an economy is to support the people who own the economy, the top 1%. And all the rest of us who are not in the top 1%, who work in the fields, as it were, we're here to, support the owners of the economy. Whereas progressives would say, no, the purpose of the economy is to support the 99%, and the 1% have to be constrained in their greed, shall we say. So then he goes through this just brilliant analysis of the debate between Jefferson and Hamilton about what kind of country we were going to be and what kind of government we're going to have. And he says, we find Thomas Jefferson carefully analyzing the society for which he was to organize a government. And he quotes Jefferson saying, most of the laboring class possess property, cultivate. It goes on like this. He said, these people had two sets of rights, personal competency and those involved in acquiring and possessing personal property. And he goes through what that means. And then he talks about how in the middle of the 19th century, he says, it was the middle of the 19th century that a new force was released and a new dream created. The force is what is called the Industrial Revolution. The dream was the dream of an economic machine able to raise the standard of living for everyone. And then he talks about how the history of the 1800s, he says the history of the last half century, the last half of the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution, is accordingly, in large measure, a history of the group of financial titans whose methods were not scrutinized with too much care and who were honored in proportion to the results they produced, irrespective of the means they used. These financiers who pushed the railroads to the Pacific were always ruthless. It has been estimated that the American investor paid for the American railway system more than 3 times over in the process. But despite the fact that net advantage was to the United States. And then he goes into the doctrines of business, and he talks about tariffs, and he talks about all this stuff. And he says, in retrospect, we can now see that the turn of the tide came at the turn of the century. This would be right around 1900. And talks about how we were hitting the last frontier, and Teddy Roosevelt was the trust buster, and Woodrow Wilson tried to do something, but World War I intervened. And then he gets to the meat of the matter. Keep in mind, this is 1932, the depths of the Great Depression. He said, a glance at the situation today only too clearly indicates that equality of opportunity as we have known it no longer exists. It is still true that men can start small enterprises, quoting Franklin Roosevelt, trusting to native shrewdness and the ability to keep abreast of competitors. But area after area has been preempted altogether by the great corporations. And even in the fields, which still have no great concerns, in other words, even in those areas, where there's not a big business, the small man starts with a handicap. The independent businessman is running a losing race. He is squeezed out, in President Wilson's words, by highly organized corporate competitors, as your corner grocery man can tell you. Recently, a careful study was made of the concentration of business in the United States, said Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. It showed that our economic life was dominated by some 600-odd corporations who controlled 2/3 of American industry. More striking still, at the end of another century, we shall have all American industry controlled by a dozen corporations and run by perhaps 100 men. Put plainly, we are steering a steady course toward economic oligarchy. Now, there's this council that George Bush, one of his, I think it was his Commerce Secretary, was the head of. It's a group of 100 of the CEOs of the 100 largest companies in the United States. I mean, we're already there, right? He says, clearly, all this calls for a reappraisal of values. Just as in older times, the central government was the first haven of refuge and then became a threat. And he was talking about the old kingdoms. You know, they organized the kingdoms to protect themselves from the rapacious barons, and then the kings turned on them. He says, so now, in a closer economic system, the central and ambitious financial unit is no longer a servant of national desire, but a danger to our nation. Every man has a right to life. And this means that he also has a right to make a comfortable living. He may, by sloth or crime, decline to exercise that right, but it may not be denied him. Our industrial and agricultural mechanism can produce enough to spare. Whenever, Franklin Roosevelt said at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, whenever the lone wolf, the unethical competitor, the reckless promoter declines to join in achieving an end recognized as being for the public welfare, the government may properly be asked to apply restraint. Likewise, should that group ever use its collective power contrary to the public welfare, the government must be swift to enter and protect the public interest. Listen to these words as you were watching Mr. Trump stack his cabinet with military people and billionaires. Now, this is a guy who went to a military academy because his father couldn't handle him. So he's comfortable around generals, and he was born, basically in inflated dollars, born a billionaire, and is still a billionaire. He's lived around billionaires his whole entire life. That's all he's comfortable with. Anyhow, back to FDR. Faith in America, he said, demands that we recognize the new terms of the old social contract. This is what he was elected on. We shall fulfill them. As we fulfill the obligation of the apparent utopia which Jefferson imagined for us in 1776 and which Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Wilson sought to bring to realization, we must do so lest a rising tide of misery engendered by our common failure engulf us all. But failure is not an American habit, and in the strength of great hope, we must all shoulder our common load. That's how he ended his speech. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Commonwealth Club of San Francisco, September 23rd, 1932. Brilliant. I encourage you to look it up and read it. But he was prophesying this moment.